single, you're probably navigating a fascinating contradiction. On the one hand, you have dating apps, social media, arranged marriage. On the other, you're carrying a brain that evolved millions of years ago on the African savannah.
Men's strength probably mattered more than it does today because most of us don't require our male partners to stab somebody to protect us on the street.
You might think that you're making a decision based on shared values, music tastes, whether they reply on time, but actually in the background, ancient psychology might be pulling the strings.
It's tapping into the part that if your partner's your friends too, right? Like you're in an endeavor together. It can't be just that she's hot.
Today I'm thrilled to explore these questions and more with Dr. Catherine Salmon, PhD in evolutionary psychology and professor of psychology and human animal studies at the University of Redlands.
There's some studies that show that if men post pictures of them with other people's children and with pets, anything that would hint at empathy or being able to relate to other people generally is seen as indications that this person might actually be a good dad.
Today we'll be looking at how evolutionary forces shape attraction, dating, and marriage.
There's some evidence that birth order shapes personality, that it can make people more or less compatible with each other as well.
So let's find out. In today's world, are we just slaves to our evolution, or can we override it?
And deception in terms of how willing a man would be to deceive a woman about how interested he is in a long-term relationship or about how attached he is to her in order to get her involved in a sexual relationship.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Ask the Expert, bringing you expert insights from those who've walked the talk. Today we are very pleased to be joined by Dr. Catherine Salmon. Welcome,
Thank you
Doctor.
for having me.
Lovely. So for the purposes of our audience, can you give us an overview of the ways in which our evolution may be impacting our romantic relationships?
We often think of ourselves as being very much in control of our decisions and that everything is sort of a very cerebral kind of thing, and we make decisions about what we like and what we don't like. And we don't necessarily always think about why we might like those things and whether really some of those preferences that we have and things that we enjoy are actually sort of unconscious in many ways, right? Like we might not really understand why we really find one particular person very attractive and somebody else less attractive. And I think that really is kind of the product of all of those years of evolutionary history. I mean, what preferences led to us being successful didn't necessarily have to be conscious. As long as we felt a certain way, that was what led to success and survival and reproduction. Whether you want to call them instinctual or whatever, we don't think about those kinds of things, but they still play a really big role in many of the things we do, whether it's in sort of a romantic or mating arena, or whether it's just in how we deal with the workplace or the kinds of friends that we have outside of the workplace and the way we interact with our families.
We have spent millennia evolving to survive, and our modern environment has only recently changed dramatically. What are the preferences that you find both men and women seek in an ideal mate, and why might those preferences exist?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot, right? Like there's a lot. I might sort of classify them into certain things. There's aspects of physical appearance that males and females find attractive in the opposite sex. And there's aspects of personality, right, that are relevant, but also even things like odor cues and the sound of people's voices are things that we find attractive or not. And so many of those things, say, for example, females in terms of their attraction to males, like what they find attractive in men, are features that would have led to reproductive success for women if they mated with those men, right? So we're thinking about traits that make him a good provider, traits that can make him a good protector, traits that indicate that he's going to be committed and a faithful partner, and somebody that you have compatible values with and that's going to be fun to be around, right? Like there's all of these things. And in the ancestral world, that could have meant your life or death and the life or death of any children that you had. And for men, when they're looking at the attractiveness of women, right, what leads to reproductive success for men is mating with a woman who's young and she's healthy and you're going to be able to have lots of children, but you also care about the person that she is and, you know, the ways that you may be either similar or different and how you get along. And they mattered more in some cases in the ancestral environment, right? Because, say, for example, men's strength probably mattered more than it does today because most of us don't require our male male partners to stab somebody to protect us on the street. I mean, some places people do, but most places people don't. But that would have mattered more when some of the biggest threats came from other humans in our past.
So what are those traits that, we look for nowadays that might be proxies for protection and leadership and being able to be a provider?
Yeah, I mean, one of them is just income. It sounds crass, but that is one thing that people care about, right? And there are proxies for that, right? It's not like you necessarily need to know how much income a man makes, right? It's what kind of occupation does he have? What kind of education does he have? How much ambition does he have, right? Because personality traits drive that too. Is he intelligent? It's very clear that women have to be assessing it on that level, because a lot of times you do form relationships relatively young in life, and people haven't attained, the levels that they're going to in their careers, right? But what you want is evidence of a drive to get to wherever they are intending to go. Yeah. And the idea that they have an intent to go somewhere, that their dream is not to stay where they are in high school or when they're an undergrad, right? But I mean, there's a reason that like doctors and lawyers in university, when they're going to school, are also very popular, because again, there's that projection of what they might be achieving when they leave. But there are lots of other, of course, areas of interest when people are in college that may still predict success in other areas as long as people have drive, right?
Exactly. I think you can have drive in any field, whether you're an artist, whether you're a musician, or, it's more a personality characteristic, I'd say, than like specific to any one domain. But what I'm always curious about is where natural selection actually contradicts with sexual selection. You mentioned how men sometimes post photos of fancy cars and lavish vacations. That kind of conspicuous spending seems antithetical to protecting one's resources and their survival. So in what scenarios do individuals choose to become more appealing and attractive to the opposite sex, sometimes at the expense of their own survival?
When you think about it, the animal world provides the best example, right? The peacock's tail, right? It is a useless organ, right, for anything but display to the female members of the species. And it's a costly display for them, right? It's harder to get away from a predator if you're flying with this huge, humongous tail behind you. So only really fit males have really big, large, high-quality tails. Some of what you're touching on deals with the issues around conspicuous consumption and how much it's an accurate reflection of people's resources versus a fake one, right? The online world of dating creates a whole other layer to that, right? In terms of, okay, does this person really have these resources, skills, whatever they are? Or even from the perspective of a man looking at women, does she really look like that when I meet her in person, right? There's a certain amount of deception that can happen in the mating domain. And I think that area, the conspicuous advertising of things that the other sex wants, is an area where that can certainly become a problem.
But I think it's always existed, right? Either being deceptive about your intentions with a partner, deceptive about your ability to provide for a partner in the interest of mating.
Yeah, for sure. Even deception in terms of how willing a man would be to deceive a woman about how interested he is in a long-term relationship, or about how attached he is to her, in order to get her involved in a sexual relationship.
From an evolutionary point of view, why might women be choosier than men?
The main reason is that, of course, women can bear a higher cost of making a mistake in the mate choice, right? I mean, if you enter into a sexual relationship, you think the relationship is going to be long-term and the partner is going to be faithful. You're the one who's pregnant and has a child to take care of on your own, which is a much more challenging thing than doing it with a partner. And so I think women have always had that cost that males don't have. I mean, nowadays we chase men around and make them pay for child support, but ancestrally, nobody was doing that. We didn't have third-party justice like an illegal system to do that. In particular, when it comes to things like cues of men's willingness to commit, cues that he really loves her, like those are really important for women to know before you're going to commit this much to the relationship. Whereas for men, it's easier because they aren't carrying a baby and they can walk away.
There's sort of this asymmetric reproductive biology going on.
It's true in other animals too, right? If you look at other mammals, all of the internal gestating females have this problem, and all of them are pickier than the males, right? For that reason.
So it's important. I think we are discerning, and this is something that's hard-coded from much, much before.
I would even say, like, some things women may be even pickier about now, just because the world we live in, you see a wider range than your actually realistic range in terms of partners. And so you may think that the average guy in your mating pool is what you're also seeing on social media and TV and movies and whatever. And that's not really your mating pool. You know, it's an artificial one in that sense.
Yeah.
And I think that can make you have artificially high standards.
With the influx of social media, how do you think this perceived options impacted our ability to make clear decisions about a mate?
We see a lot of delayed marriages. We see a lot of delayed or postponed child rearing. Some of that is simply there's too much choice. And the more choice you have, the more difficult it is to make that choice, and you worry more about whether you've made the right choice or not, rather than if you lived in a village with 100 people and you got 3 choices, make them. It's a lot easier to do that than to deal with this. Sometimes I have difficulty in terms of figuring out where you stand in the market, like how good of a catch you are versus how good of a catch the persons that you're interested in is. So how is that actually playing out? Some women probably have an overinflated sense and some women have an underinflated sense.
Or maybe they're getting a lot of attention and validation.
If they're posting pictures and things like that. Yeah, and so you don't necessarily have as clear an evaluation of that, because the system, right, like that we have for doing that evolved in a face-to-face world, not in a world with social media, which we didn't even have it when I was growing up, right? So it's quite a recent change.
Very new,
especially from that evolutionary perspective. Like, we have not really had time to calibrate to it, I don't think, very well.
How objective are people today at assessing their own mate value, so to speak? And how can people evaluate themselves better so that they don't end up marrying someone far out of their league or far below their league?
So there's 2 parts to that. I mean, one of them, the question about how accurate people are at assessing their own sort of mate value in that sense. I'm actually involved in doing a study where we're trying to do some assessments of that. We're having people rate themselves and then have other people rating them. We certainly have a lot of people who are not very accurate in both directions, like going high or going low, in both sexes as well, that seem to be quite different from what the objective person who doesn't know them, who's rating them, is. Even when they are attractive themselves, and there's no reason to think that they would not be able to find partners, but then they start talking about what they want in a partner, and it's like, there are 2 of those in the world. I don't know that that's going to be an option.
Yeah, like, I want to date an F1 racer, but really there's like 30.
Yeah, exactly. We protect our own self-esteem a little bit. While we all might want to think that we're 10s, maybe we're not all 10s. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because again, this comes back to the reason why if you're a 7, it's better to be with a 7 or an 8 than a 10, is that if you're well matched, you generally tend to be satisfied with the relationship. You think you've made a good deal for yourself, right? And you're less inclined to have a wandering eye for other opportunities. It might seem like a great idea to catch the NBA star or, the Hollywood movie star, but those are actually people who have an awful lot of temptations. And if you're out of that range, the likelihood of the relationship having that long-term durability is a little bit less. Occasionally you see people where you might think, well, physically they're not a match, but there are other traits typically that make that person really attractive, right? Because either they have resources, or they're a really great person, or they're really funny, or they've got, other traits that make you really compatible. But when you put them all together, you need to be in the same ballpark, I think. Otherwise, somebody either is overprotective. So the people with the pathological jealousy, they're always worried the partner's going to cheat, or the partner actually is a wandering person because they see themselves as having other opportunities.
Yeah, so interesting. I think about the Pete Davidson effect. He's this comedian who's not conventionally attractive, but has dated, is notorious for dating really, really attractive women. And like you said, maybe sense of humor, maybe access to resources. If you're a tech billionaire, maybe you don't have to be ripped and have like all these muscles, because you have, in today's social currency, you have the biggest muscle of all.
Success in whatever area, right? Whether you're like a really successful comedian or a really successful tech giant, whatever it is, those things are signaling, access to those kinds of resources and the ability to provide. Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit more about how if an individual has a lot of attention from the opposite gender, how that may make someone more attractive?
Well, there's a phenomenon known as mate copying. The idea that instead of going through all of the process of figuring out whether an individual is actually a really good catch or not, you just do what other people have done. So like if somebody else is interested in a guy, then he must be worth it because they've already expended this effort, and so you should go after them. You could imagine the same effect with a girl if there's a lot of guys that are interested. And so it may be that like that kind of phenomenon tends to cluster around celebrities because, again, if you've got a few people that think that they're really special, then everybody is going to think that they're really special. And I mean, the problem with that sort of phenomenon is that, there's lots of women that have been involved in that, and they write lots of stories about what happens, but those people are always having a lot of short-term mating with a lot of different people. And so, at least at those stages in their life, they're not really looking for long-term mating opportunities.
We work with a lot of members who are building profiles where they present themselves online many times. And we have had conversations about how men have more success when they have like other women in their pictures sometimes, like female friends around them or female, close female relatives, just because is a sense of trust that, if there are women around him, he must be safe enough at least, and he must have positive female relationships in his life, which to me at least is actually really important. Like a guy who has sisters or who has had female friends or girls in the past who he's dated. That's like actually a good thing for me.
Anything that shows like a softer side to men, or a more emotional attachment kind of aspect, because most people want a partner that is going to be a friend as well as a romantic partner, right? I mean, if you're going to be together for 40 years, you pretty much better be friends or you're going to, kill each other over that length of time. There's some studies that show that if men post pictures of them with other people's children and with pets, like anything that would hint at empathy or being able to relate to other people generally is seen as indications that this person might actually be a good dad.
Evolution does drive us towards these masculine, sort of quote unquote alpha men who appear capable to take risks and be daring and to, in some cases, take on physical challenges and be violent at times. And at the same time, we also seek that emotional stability, kindness, intelligence, extroversion, things like that. So that flexibility is more important than just being nurturing and warm and kind, and also just being a powerful go-getter.
The reality is whether we want to admit it or not, we all want it all. If you want a partner and a father, you want them to be all of those things, tender, gentle, caring with you and your children, and you want him to be effective in his workplace, whatever that requires, to be capable of defending you and your family if things are problematic. I think that it is a big ask sometimes, right, for guys, that they be able to do all those things.
Right.
I think that men do recognize at some level that both the gentleness and the success are part of what is appealing. And that is why, if I go to the shopping mall near where I live, there will be a bunch of guys at the outdoor mall walking their dogs and picking up the girls, because everybody goes, funny. Oh, you have such a sweet dog. Something to pet it. And then talk to him. Smart. And there was a study done looking at that, and men were more likely to get women's phone numbers when they had a cute dog than by themselves for the same guy.
Yeah, so it seems like obviously men have picked up on that. And even though at times they may seem antithetical, it's important that we allow masculinity to have a broader definition. It seems like there are some traits that both genders value in terms of kindness, intelligence, emotional stability, and then each individual gender favors different things. For example, men looking at youthfulness and fertility, which can show up in physical appearance, whether that's clear eyes, clear skin, waist to hip, shiny hair, waist to hip ratio, all of these things, and women looking for not just income, not just present, maybe economic status, but overall ability to provide resources and protection, specifically when seeking a long-term mate.
One way of thinking about it is that there are many things that men and women have in common that are the things that help you interact with each other over long periods of time, like the kindness and intelligence and everything. But the differences that you mainly see are just that women don't prioritize men's attractiveness as much as men prioritize women's attractiveness and youth. And women actually prefer men that are a little bit older. And it's at that level. It's just a shifting of it. And then there are these things that we have in common that really are what makes relationships work.
To what extent can we override our evolutionary programming, or how subordinate are we really still, right? Because given that now I have all the resources I want, assuming, then would my feeling of attraction actually change? Can my prefrontal cortex really make autonomous decisions independent of millennia of evolution?
I think if you look at the mating choices of wealthy women, they generally don't marry their pool boys. Occasionally they do. Jennifer Lopez's first husband, I believe, was one of her backup dancers. But that was not true for her later husbands, who were more, they might not have been her equal because she certainly had a lot of money, but they certainly were more close to her in terms of status anyways, even if not actual monetary, worth. So, there have been some studies that have looked at the mate preferences of wealthier women and things like that. And it doesn't look like they have at this point said, I don't care about his status, I care about how pretty he is, or something else. Some of it is just driven by which choices are likely to be the most successful for you. And because for so long, these things were the ones that mattered, we've, got all of this history in terms of shaping our preferences. I also think it's worth pointing out that, evolution hasn't stopped, right? We still can change. And so if we go for a long enough period of time, right, where women have as much or more money than men, maybe it will shift, right? It might be that women who marry men who have less resources but are better dads or something might actually, or they're more attractive or they're more physically fit, they might outrank these other women, right? And then that would shift preferences.
On the whole, I also find it really interesting how very wealthy, successful older men do have access to young women in their early 20s, right? And they may choose to mate with them. But I'm also seeing a lot of those same individuals choosing to marry women who are still older and who are still more successful. And what that makes me reflect on is how the core values, as you mentioned, and the personality traits sometimes can, in the order of priority, outweigh the physical youthfulness and the, just natural beauty of being really, really young.
If you're an older man and you're looking for a long-term companion, right, you might not have a lot in common. Celine Dion and her husband were an example where there was a huge age gap between them, but they seemed to make it work. They never broke up, and they had some children together and everything. So I think there's lots of examples where occasionally it seems to work. But I think that for a lot of men, as they get older, they also are not maybe quite so strongly ruled by their hormones as they are when they're younger. And so they may make more thoughtful choices about what's going to work in my relationship, especially if they've had a relationship that didn't end well, right? Their second and in some cases third choices may be more compatible in terms of many of those things. And I don't think men generally are probably thinking, well, I don't want to have babies anymore, so I want an older woman. I don't think it usually is that way, but I think it's probably that the women that they're interacting with are older, and there are very attractive older women now. We have lots of cosmetic surgery, but we also have lots of ways of protecting our skin that we didn't in the ancestral environment, right? It's tapping into the part that if your partner's your friends too, right? You're in an endeavor together, and you need to have those shared things to make it work over the long haul. And it can't be just that she's hot.
So, that is sort of heartening for ambitious women out there who are getting older and who are building their careers. The right man who wants to build the right long-lasting relationship with you isn't going to care that you're not 22. Like, he's going to value the fact that you have a lot more in common and that you're able to like have a deep intellectual stimulating connection.
And again, and I think it's worth considering the fact that there are women that are in their 40s that you would think are the same age as their daughters that are like 20. And I think that that's testament to the fact that we can actually take care of ourselves. And that actually tells you something about a person when it's just that they actually care about themselves, they are healthy, they're fit.
So I think as women get older, they really focus on trying to keep as many of those signals of youth and attractiveness that help increase their mate value in the marriage market. I want to talk a little bit about our cultural environment. So you're sitting in the US, obviously, and we're in India. In your experience and through your research, how has an individual's culture impacted their mate preferences or their relationship dynamics? And do you find that there are differences?
I think there are definitely differences because I think there are a number of things that impact people's mating choices other than just what we want, right? And what we think we can get. And family is one of those things that influence it a lot in some cultures. I think a lot of Americans probably don't think about that very much. My students don't think about that very much. But in many cultures, that is really important, right? Your family's support is really important. And so family perspectives on your mate choices matter a lot. And historically, you know, if you think about ancestral humans, it made a huge difference, right? All sorts of arranged marriages, right, in different kinds of cultures. Cultural values about things like child rearing, religion, those things matter a lot in terms of people's compatibility. You know, in some cultures, if you make a mating mistake, divorce is not as well accepted as in other cultures, and remarriage is more challenging than in other cultures. And that makes those decisions more impactful for people in the sense that I think they worry more about them and they want to, like, there's a really strong focus on getting it right that you don't necessarily always see in places like California, where it's a little bit more disposable.
It's like, I think culture has descended from evolutionary drivers in some sense, right? Like, for example, to select a partner within your religion is really just, you know, an ancestral version of you picking someone who probably shares the same values as you, has a similar lifestyle as you, probably is like someone who's more trustworthy because they were in your immediate community.
But there definitely are cultural differences that are shaped by historical factors. They're shaped by ecological factors, all sorts of things like that play a role in people's decisions. But yeah, this is the tribal in-group. And your in-group can be chosen by your religion, by your ethnicity, by your caste, by all sorts of things.
So I'll give you my own example. My mom's American. She's from Kansas. My dad is Indian. The fact that you can marry someone so far out of your in-group, which is, again, a very new phenomenon. I'm just like curious your thoughts on how that impacts compatibility and long-term relationship success.
Yeah, what kind of personality traits that you have. Some of those just transcend those differences between groups, right? You know, are you both conscientious? Are you both agreeable or not, right? Like how those things play out, certainly I think are really important things. And those things are less frequently shaped by culture. But I think if people have really big cultural differences in terms of things that you can even have as differences within cultures, at least in certain places, like somebody has really strong views politically or about, you know, topics like abortion or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Those can be highly conflictual. But they can happen even within those cultural groups, not just between them. From just like a biological standpoint, I think sometimes pairs where they're coming from different ethnic groups, their children often are healthier and more attractive. And so it seems like there might be some benefits to that.
Yeah. Sometimes that genetic dissimilarity can be very favorable to like the immune system of the offspring. But at the same time, like you said, like views on gender roles is so different between cultures, just in my experience. So having to adjust and be like, okay, well, I'm not going to expect the same thing out of my wife that a lot of other Indian wives are expected of. Like being able to be flexible. I think that's where our more recent prefrontal cortex can come in and override some of the other things.
I mean, to the extent that there was a division of labor in the ancestral environment, right, and that men maybe did more hunting and women did more gathering, but both worked. You know, it's not like somebody got a free ride out of that. It was not working, right?
No.
And in the modern world, there's even 100 years ago, there was a division of labor, but it wasn't, but there's a devaluation sometimes that I don't think there was in the ancestral world, but I think there is now, of the inside the homework. And I think that is something that can be a problem for some people. I suspect it happens less for the ones who meet at universities, because they're usually people who are already pursuing certain kinds of occupations that may make their role less traditional.
How does our birth order impact our partner search or the relationship outcome of that? I know it's like a newer area of research.
Parental expectations for their children, right? Parents often have very high expectations for their firstborn children. And so firstborn children are often very conscientious and very driven. And so when we think about the personality that might be shaped by birth order in some ways, right? Some of our personalities, just genes, it can make people more or less compatible with each other as well, right? So in general, if individuals are super dominant, right? Like if that aspect of extroversion, right? Extroversion can be sociability or it can be dominance. If it's the dominance part, right? Two people who are really dominant may have a lot more conflict over who's running the show, and may not be very good at sorting that out. I think that could be a challenge. Often not sharing the same birth order can be helpful if for couples. And also that middleborns sometimes are just more flexible in terms of stuff, just because they've always been squeezed in terms of having to negotiate for resources, that they may just do better with that. And so they can kind of go with almost anybody, but that sometimes two firsts can have some headbutting.
I see. And where do only children lie?
Onlys are too used to having all of the attention. And so they don't really necessarily do well with somebody else that also is expecting that perspective. A lot of that can depend on how the parents have raised their only children. Like some parents are very conscious of the fact that they have one child and that child needs more socialization early on with other children, that can actually sort of alleviate some of that, what they used to call the little emperor syndrome with little Chinese only boys, that they're not, like the world doesn't just revolve around them. Because there are more and more only children, right? Because the birth rate has decreased so much in many parts of the world. And so it'll also be interesting to see if there's more research looking on that with them now that there are more of them. Because when I was a student, there were still lots of big families.
I have a little fun game that we often play with our guests. It's called He's a 10 But. And I want you to answer these questions from an evolutionary standpoint. So she's a 10, but she refuses to plan for the future.
Probably like a 6 or 7.
It doesn't drop all the way to a 1.
Because if he can do the planning for them, then like it can kind of compensate.
He's a 7, but he has a lot of dangerous, risky hobbies like motorcycling.
It kind of depends. Does he have a good life insurance policy? But probably, I mean, I think it would decrease it like to a 4 or 5, maybe. It probably would depend a little on how good he was at those risky things, right? Because I think some risky jobs pay really well and some risky things raise status. So it kind of depends on, the trade-off. Yeah.
She's a 10, but she's significantly more attractive than you are.
So what I think from an evolutionary perspective is that it should lower it, but I think for most men it doesn't lower it as much as it probably should.
I was thinking the same.
It probably just brings it down to a 9. He's still going to do it.
I mean, that's the dream, right? That's the dream. Yeah. Maybe in that moment you're not really thinking about long-term. It's not up here. Yeah, this is not driving the car. He has 18-inch biceps, but he's easily spooked by spiders and runs away.
I think that actually drops it a fair bit, and I'll explain why. So to me, I think that would drop it to like a 6. And the reason I say that is that I think that ability of men to protect, their willingness to do it is more important than whether they have the big muscles. So if he's a bodybuilder and some guy pulls a knife and he runs away, that's no good. You need him, even if he's a skinny guy, to be willing to pull the knife. And then that's probably a good thing, right? So you could be physically a 5, but if you're willing to stand up, that pushes you up.
Interesting. So there's that nuance there. Like everything is much more complex.
I think that normally those things would be tied together, the willingness to defend and the strength. But actually, there was a study that just came out this year that showed if you try and detangle them by making the men only have one of those traits, it actually looks like the willingness matters more.
Sometimes you can try really hard and use your force of will to protect someone.
And in the modern world, you can pull a weapon. It doesn't necessarily just have to be your biceps. I mean, in the US, if you were in a state with a carry law, you can pull a gun and save her life. You don't need to like punch the other guy in the face. So I think there's that, and like skill in fighting could also maybe swamp muscles in some cases too.
Maybe that is what we define as big dick energy, right? Like he's a really short guy, but he has big dick energy. Like there's something about his aura that's just like, wow. I
have a colleague that's like that in the sense that he's, like my height,
smaller stature,
short, but people will just move out of the way when he moves around a room.
Wonderful. So those were all of my questions. Thank you so very much, Dr. Salmon. This was incredibly enlightening and a truly enriching conversation. I enjoyed it greatly.
I had a great time too. It was a lot of fun to talk about.
Thank you so much for watching another episode of Ask the Expert. If you enjoyed this video, do be sure to hit subscribe, share it with your friends, and leave in the comment section below what more questions you'd like us to ask an evolutionary psychologist. Bye.